Hi everyone. Last month I participated in the online conference Religious Tolerance in an Age of Secularism, which was organized by my colleagues at Utrecht University. Now I decided to upload a video recording of the presentation, which gives a glimpse of a short book I'm writing at the moment titled Why Do Religious Forms Matter? These days, we are all very busy, of course, and we don't always have time to read each other's papers, but maybe you do have time to listen to a short presentation. And if you have any suggestions, comments, or questions, please write them below in the comment section or send me an email. Today, I'm going to speak about a curious incident in which Jürgen Habermas misquoted the late John Rawls. I think that the incident stands for a broader, unfortunate misreading of Rawls's idea of public reason, which is crucial for his conception of tolerance in liberal democracies, and I believe also relevant for our current debates about religious pluralism, secularism, and about both the forms and contents of public reasoning. I will then mention two objections, even though, of course, we can think of more, but I mention these two with the intention to first get the textual facts straight. The misquotation occurs in Habermas's essay, Religion in the Public Sphere, in both the original German and English translation. Habermas's discussion is in fact a lengthy and ongoing engagement with Rawls's book Political Liberalism, which was published in the 1980s, and in particular with Rawls's revised essay on the idea of public reason that was published in 1997. The fundamental question Habermas is interested in can be found in that essay by Rawls, from which Habermas quotes as follows. How is it possible for those of faith to endorse a constitutional regime, even when their comprehensive doctrines may not prosper under it and indeed may decline? In this quote, the emphasis is on those of faith who must learn to endorse a constitutional regime, even if their comprehensive doctrines may decline. The question is so important to Habermas's argument that he quotes it again in his concluding remarks. This time we read, how is it possible for those of faith, as well as the non-religious, to endorse a secular regime, even when their comprehensive doctrines may not prosper under it, and indeed may decline? So, not only religious people, but also the non-religious are included. How can they all endorse a secular regime? Notice that the word secular has replaced the earlier constitutional, transforming the Rawlsian logic into an explicitly secular one defended by Habermas. Before I go further, now let's look at the passage in Rawls himself. How is it possible, or is it, for those of faith as well as the non-religious, secular, to endorse a constitutional regime, even when their comprehensive doctrines may not prosper under it, and indeed may decline? Rawls did indeed start by requesting something from religious citizens, that they abide by a political conception of justice concerned with the basic structure of political liberalism. But Rawls goes one step further to express his question more sharply, wondering whether it is possible not only for religious persons, but also for the non-religious secular, to affirm a constitutional regime, even if their comprehensive doctrines may decline under it. In Habermas's essay, in the first instance, the reference to non-religious, so in the first quotation, the reference to non-religious secular people is deleted to direct attention to religious citizens only. While the second time Habermas quotes the passage, he transports the word secular from the level of a citizen who may be non-religious or secular to that of the regime. That is, changing Rawls's constitutional regime into a secular regime. Rawls himself never describes his preferred state as secular. He always described it as a constitutional or a democratic regime, and liberal on the meta level of the political conception of justice only. So one can be a conservative Catholic, for instance, and affirm liberal democracy as a political system. The normative guiding distinction for Rawls is not the secular versus the religious, but the democratic versus the non-democratic, political liberalism versus illiberal forms of governance. So at this point, two objections may be raised. The first is that both Habermas and Rawls defend the separation of church and state, and therefore that the distinction between a secular regime or a constitutional regime, it doesn't really matter. It's irrelevant. Secular, constitutional, same thing. To understand why the distinction between the constitutional and the secular matters to Rawls, a liberal American who had a religious upbringing, we need to recognize that the metaphor of a separation of church and state is understood to mean that no comprehensive doctrine, religious or secular, shall be imposed by the state on all citizens. So Rawls writes, "It is also a grave error to think that the separation of church and state is primarily for the protection of secular culture. Of course, it does protect that culture, but no more so than it protects all religions. In fact, if Habermas's misquotation did not blatantly contradict Rawls's theory, I would, as a reader, never have noticed it." A second objection is that both Habermas and Rawls have a restrictive understanding of which reasons ultimately count in matters of governance. Although the point of Habermas's intention in that essay was to open our minds to the possibility of a so-called complementary learning process between secular and religious citizens, it has been widely noted that beneath this seemingly religion-friendly argument for a so-called post-secular society lies a secularist philosophical background, deeply suspicious of religion. Regarding the secular nature of the constitutional state, Habermas's position is clear. In reference to Rawls, he requires that religious citizens translate their views into secular language to be eligible for inclusion in the formal public sphere. So Habermas says, every citizen must know and accept that only secular reasons count beyond the institutional threshold that divides the informal public sphere from parliaments, courts, ministries, and administrations. Habermas does mention, however, that Rawls explicitly refuses, Habermas does not mention that Rawls explicitly refuses to identify public reason as secular reason. So one more time, for Rawls, secular reason and public reason, they are not the same thing. So what does he write about that? A view often expressed is that while religious reasons and sectarian doctrines should not be invoked to justify legislation in a democratic society. Sound secular arguments may be, but what is a secular argument? Some think of any argument that is reflective and critical, publicly intelligible and rational, as a secular argument. A central feature of political liberalism is that it views all such arguments the same way it views religious ones, and therefore, these secular philosophical doctrines do not provide public reasons. Rawls writes in another passage, "We must distinguish public reason from what is sometimes referred to as secular reason and secular values. These are not the same as public reason. For I define secular reason as reasoning in terms of comprehensive non-religious doctrines. Such doctrines and values are much too broad to serve the purposes of public reason." So Rawls encourages citizens to introduce their comprehensive doctrines, religious and not religious, as he says, at any time, into political discussion, provided that citizens also give reasons that others can make sense of, not right away, but as he says, in due course, depending on context. So he does not equate public reason with secular reason. You might then wonder, what is public reason? Rawls gives almost no concrete examples, but it is telling that when he does, he names the abolitionists and the civil rights movement. No matter how much they stress their religious roots, Rawls writes, there is, quote, "no better example to illustrate the force of public reason in political life," end quote. So outside specialist political philosophy, this Rawlsian framework is often misrepresented. The sociologist Craig Calhoun, for instance, claims that Rawls allows religious discourse only if it is translated into secular terms, while suggesting that, quote, Habermas has gone further, worrying that the demand for translation imposes an asymmetrical burden on religious citizens. Calhoun writes that, quote, Rawls uses the notion of translation to describe the ways in which the rational arguments of religious people are rendered accessible to secular interlocutors. He also writes, quote, perhaps translation is not meant literally. So maybe Rawls only meant it as a metaphor for the activity of becoming able to understand the arguments of another. But that is an already important distinction, Calhoun observes, right? So between literal translation and a metaphor for an activity to understand someone else. Calhoun's assertion that Rawls uses the notion of translation, together with the remark that it is perhaps not meant literally, is odd, since Rawls never writes about translation. Indeed, never uses the word, let alone suggest translation into secular language. Well, Habermas actually does make such a demand. Unsurprisingly, Calhoun's claim is not backed by an actual page reference. Talal Assad's last book, Secular Translations, similarly confuses the book Theory of Justice with political liberalism, giving the impression of not checking the works before writing about them. A more nuanced interpretation recognizes Rawls's optimism that people can and should be enabled to reason from within their comprehensive doctrines in ways that can be recognized as public reason. This holds not only for Christian doctrines, but Rawls also names Islam as compatible with political liberalism. For liberal thinkers and politicians, who often refer to the Enlightenment in contentious media debates, Rawls's position may strike as weird because of the distinctions he makes between freedom of inquiry and expression on the one hand, and public reason on the other. And yet, this is a crucial distinction to make. In this respect, Rawls writes, political liberalism is sharply different from and rejects Enlightenment liberalism, which historically attacked Orthodox Christianity. That's quite strongly put. Rejects Enlightenment liberalism, which historically attacked Orthodox Christianity. Public reason, which Rawls defines as concerning constitutional essentials only, does not attack religions or non-religious worldviews. That's not the language a statesman should use, according to the philosopher. The freedom of expression, however, does guarantee the right to criticize religions and other philosophies in the informal public sphere, in books, social media, television, and so on. Another piece of the Rawlsian puzzle can be found in a posthumous letter published in 2009. There he explains political liberalism by contrasting it with Spinoza's conception of tolerance. Spinoza, according to Rawls, came to toleration only after rejecting or changing his religious faith. The problem, Rawls writes, is that a specific philosophical doctrine, such as Spinoza's, is only one among others, and tolerance for diverse views should not depend on it, should not depend on a radical enlightenment package that all citizens must endorse. So, the hope of settling religious and philosophical controversies, in other words, must be abandoned on the level of public reason. To truly tolerate them is to make space for differences that refuse to be effaced, to do so within the bounds of the constitutional state, and to indefinitely strive for a truly public reason for all citizens alike. Now, there are more objections, of course, to Rawls's theory of political liberalism. For example, what about the affects? Does Rawls take the power of affects sufficiently serious? What about the power of the secular state? These are all valid criticisms, and in my short book, I will also discuss those criticisms. But I think it's important that we get the author's texts right, and that we interpret texts fairly, even if they are written by very famous and very respectable philosophers. We should keep an open mind and, read the primary text. This is something that I tell myself and I tell my students. So thank you for your attention, and good luck with the last phase, hopefully, of the pandemic.